Welcome to our Printmakers presentation. I am Sheryl White, Coordinator of Visitor Engagement and Exhibitions here at the Arnold Arboretum. I will be your host this morning. As exhibition coordinator, I have the wonderful job of reading proposals from artists, meeting with prospective artists, and sometimes the really wonderful part of offering an artist a show here at the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. I look for art and artists who have a connection to the Arboretum's focus. It could be as simple as trees, but ecology, the environment, climate, botany also figure in the mix. And more importantly, what resonates with me is an artist's personal connection with the natural world, and a special way of showing it through their art. Our exhibition, Inspired by Nature, features 5 printmakers and is a virtual show on our website. For Inspired by Nature, I had the unusual but rewarding opportunity to work with 5 artists. The Arboretum's virtual show allows viewers from near and far to savor the art. These printmakers have their own unique approach to printmaking and all have a focus on and a clear love of nature. The 5, including Mary Beth Maisel, Gail Smalley, and our 3 presenters, are members of the Nature Printing Society. These 5 meet monthly to discuss their work. I am pleased to have 3 of the exhibiting artists with us today. Arlene Bandes gives a jelly plate demonstration, Linda Goldberg talks about her art and process, and Amy McGregor-Radin demonstrates the art of white line woodcuts. First, I'd like to introduce Arlene Bandes, who has monotypes in our show and will demonstrate jelly plate printing.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. And I am so thrilled to be able to share my love of gel plate printing with you all. I'm primarily a printmaker and an art educator. And I usually, when I'm not in this pandemic time, I usually do print in a studio with a press, the way that Linda Goldberg will be demonstrating. But I've become extremely fond of the ease of working with gel plate printing. Basically, when we talk about monotypes, we're talking about one-of-a-kind prints. People tend to think of printmaking as the art form where you can make many, many, many images the same in edition printing. In monotype printing, we're working on some kind of surface that doesn't have anything on it to start. For this demonstration, I'm going to be working with a speedball gel plate. Gel plates are kind of recent to the art scene, and there's many, many companies that make them. They come in different shapes, they come in different sizes. You can also make your own plate with gelatin, as our colleague Mary Beth Maisel does. I will be using the tools of the printmaker, including brayers, I have a soft brayer, and I'm going to be working with a ink that's very easy to clean up called Akua ink, and it's also marketed by Speedball at this point. What I love about monotype printing is that there's always an element of surprise, and you can build up layers and work from one image to the next. Before I actually start working with ink, I want to show you some examples of the kinds of prints that you can get with the materials I'm working with today. All of these were made recently as I was getting kind of prepared to work with this. And for this demonstration, I'm going to be limiting myself to leaves from trees that grow in my neighborhood. It was easy to get them for this show today because the storm brought a lot of them down, so I didn't have to forage too far. So these little prints I'm showing you right now were all done exactly like I'm going to be demonstrating today. Because they're all one-of-a-kind prints, we don't ever get a second one the same. I never know, like in my little demo today, I have no idea what I'm going to come up with. So I wanted you to see a variety of what this technique can do. And one of the things that's fabulous about jelly plate printing is you can do it on your kitchen table. You don't need any fancy equipment. I'm going to be using Akua inks, but other kinds of inks and acrylic paints can be used. Sometimes I like to print on 2 plates at a time and put 1 piece of paper on top of them. And very frequently, I like to take my prints when I'm done, cut them up, and put them together in a bigger collage. This is one example of that. Actually, in the show at the Arboretum, the only work of mine that uses jelly plate printing is the gingko print that came from taking a variety of prints and making a collage. Akua inks have a reputation for drying very slowly. This is not a problem when we do the jelly plate printing because we're using very, 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 very thin layers of the ink. I'm going to transition now to, I'm going to move my device so you can see my, my plate, and I'm going to move on to the demonstration part of this. Okay, so this is my jelly plate, and one of the things I do, because I like to print in layers and build up an image rather than just taking one pull, I am going to show you a very, very, very simple way of what printmakers call registration. Registration means a system of placing your papers back on the plate so things line up. So what I'm going to do in this demo is I've just taken my jelly plate and I've placed it on a piece of paper that's exactly the size that I'm going to be printing on. Because I'm trying to make this as simple as possible today, I'm just printing on computer paper and computer cardstock. Obviously, you can print on regular archival printmaking papers. You can print on pages from old books. You can print on pages of old music books, one of my personal favorites. But we're keeping it very simple today. My intention today is showing you how extremely easy this is. I've done it with kindergarten students. For the purpose of this demo, instead of having all my jars of inks out on this tiny space I'm working on, I've just put some blobs of yellow, red, and blue Akua inks in an ice cube tray. And normally, if I were doing this, normally I would start with yellow and build up to darker colors, but I found that it's a little bit hard to see the yellow. So for starting today, I'm going to start with the red. And I'm just going to take a little bit of red, and I'm just using like a popsicle stick, and put a little bit of ink down on my jelly plate. Although it's possible to roll out inks and mix colors, I like to do my colors directly on my jelly plate. So I'm going to take a soft brayer, and I'm just going to kind of evenly roll the ink out onto the jelly plate. The jelly plate, as opposed to a piece of plexiglass, has a little give to it, and the advantage of that is you get a more organic surface to work with. So, and because of our time limitations, I'm not going to strive for perfection today. I'm going to ink things well enough for you to see what I'm doing. My brayer has 3 parts, I always tell people. It has a handle that I want to stay clean, the soft rubbery part that I'm using to roll the ink, and some kind of foot, something to stand the brayer on so it doesn't get ink where you don't want it and doesn't get dirt in the important part. So I'm going to put my brayer down on its foot on the table. And I've collected, as I said, a variety of leaves from my neighborhood. And I'm going to take a leaf. I think I'm going to start today with this leaf. And I look for the side that has the most texture, where the veins are really protruding, sort of the back of the leaf. And I'm going to start by just placing some leaves on my plate. I like to look for what I call the negative shapes, the areas left out between where I'm placing my leaves. In this case, they're all red. And I'm going to put them down. I like to look for leaves that have interesting shapes. That's just my personal aesthetic. Now I'm going to take a piece of, this is just plain computer paper. And for that registration stuff I was talking about, I'm going to line up the corners of my paper, put it down. I'm going to take my hand and rub. I always tell kids when I'm teaching that your little cushions, your little tips of your fingers, the little cushions are wonderful for rubbing. You can feel the veins, you can feel where you're working. And this first print is just going to be a red with white shapes, because I used my leaves kind of like stencils. Okay, so here's the first pull. And these prints tend to not be very interesting, but I'm going to hold on to this guy because I'm going to want it later to overprint. The simplest process I do with little kids is then take off your leaves. If I were being very, very fussy now and had all the time in the world, I'd be using some tweezers to get these up, but I'm just doing it very simply. And you can see on my plate that I have a very nice organic leftover from where those leaves had been on my ink. So the second step that I do in this simple process is to then line up on another piece of paper and print what's left on my plate. Printmakers often call that a ghost, and in this process, it's often way more interesting than that first. Okay, so this is what I get here, and one of the things I love about working with the jelly plate is you get a much more organic kind of look in the surface than I would if I were working with on my plexi plate, like I generally do. I also love the way I get a nice, like very faint color plate mark where the ink was. So now I'm just adding this to a pile. You can't see it, but I just have a pile off to my side of these prints. There's not enough ink there that it makes a difference. I can then, if I want, I'm just showing the simplest things first. I can take these leaves that used to be down in the ink, and I can place them back with the inky side up. And I could take, just so you can see this easily at the beginning, I'm going to take a clean piece of paper rather than overprinting. And I'm going to line up my corners. And press. I don't expect to have a lot of ink showing from my plate itself, but I'll get a faint impression of the leaves. If I want to press harder, sometimes I use a harder roller, and I apologize for the squeak, to press down. Okay, so this is what I have on this one. This is the very simplest way you can work. And now we'll start getting a little more complex. I'm going to remove these leaves from the plate. And I'm going to add a little bit of yellow here. My way of working, I generally with gel printing, don't bother washing my brayer or my jelly plate in between steps. I don't really mind the kind of surprises I sometimes get. Obviously, you know, for more experienced printmakers, you can mix your colors more thoughtfully and get your inks down more thoughtfully. Okay, so now I have a slightly orangier surface. I'll put down a different kind of leaf so you can see some other variety. This is a linden leaf, and again, I'm looking for the side that has more obvious veins. And I'll put a ginkgo leaf into it. It's one of my personal favorites. One of the things you can also experiment with is if you have other interesting textures around. Bubble paper is great. Corrugated cardboard is fabulous. So you can also add rubber stamps or other kinds of stencils. So I'm going to print this one now on slightly heavier paper, so you can sort of see the difference. This is just cover stock. And if you print on paper that's a little bit heavier, you're going to find that you need to press a little bit harder to get down around your leaves. Okay, so this is what I have right here, right now. And this time, I'm going to show you what happens if I print back on the same piece of paper on my plate. So this is where the registration comes in. So I'm going to match up the corners and press. This is one of the simplest ways to start building up layers. I didn't do it as carefully as I should have, but you can get the idea. And I love the way that I begin to get that organic feel in the middle there. Now I want to show you what would happen if I take that. I'm going to take this print that I did way at the beginning, and I'm going to overprint it with what I have down now, just to give you an idea of what that can do. Okay, so you can start to see how I begin to get very interesting forms inside those kind of boring white shapes. And now I think I'm going to just add a little bit of blue and try a different kind of leaf. Sometimes on purpose, I don't roll the ink out completely evenly, because sometimes I like the various kinds of patterns that the ink itself will make. Akuwa also markets something called transparent medium that you can add to your inks to help make different kinds of to mix your colors. I often like to work with leaves that have damage, because those forms can be very interesting too. So I just want to show you something a little different. So I'm putting that down. I'm going to take a piece of paper line it up, match up those corners. I'm used to having a little more elbow room when I work, so I'm trying my best here to keep things lined up. Okay, so here's this, and you can see how much fun it can be when you do have a leaf that has some openings. And now I'm going to do what I did earlier, take this off, but instead of printing it right on that same one, I kind of can tell that I have something interesting there that I might want to work on more later. So I'm going to put a slightly heavier piece of paper down and rub and pull. If somebody said to me, "What are you doing now?" I would say, "I'm pulling a print." And there's always an element of surprise. So I've gotten where I had those little openings in that linden leaf. I have the back of the paper, the plate marks showing. I'm going to show you one more thing. This is still kind of, I'm going to just roll this out, and I want to show you what happens if I put a leaf down without ink on it. Remember at the beginning, we had those white areas. And if I put leaves down now and then go back to something that has more color on it, I'm gonna just go back to this print, line it back up. Actually, I'm going to line it up because I'm using those leaves now as what people would call masks or stencils to save their shape. And that's something I often like to do also. So you can see what's happening here. I'm getting those leaves that I put down that blocked the ink are keeping that beautiful orange shape. So I think this image can give you an idea of how I could build up lots of layers. If I were doing this for what I call for real, I'd be going back and building up more and more layers. I want to talk now just about cleanup. One of the things that's so wonderful about Akua is that your cleanup can be done really easily with soap and water, or I have learned that if you have baby wipes hanging around, with baby wipes. When I go to clean up in a few minutes, I'm just going to take one baby wipe. I'll use it to clean my gel plate. I'll take my brayer, roll it out on some newsprint to get extra ink off, and then I can wipe it with the baby wipe. And then usually I wash it just to make sure it's totally clean with soap and water. I'm going to be especially sure that I clean the edges of my brayer, and sometimes we end up getting a little ink underneath, so I'm going to make sure everything's really clean, because who knows, next time I might want to start with white ink and I want my brayer perfectly clean. I hope that I inspired some of you to explore jelly plate printing. It's a fabulous way to make monotypes easily at home, and a wonderful way to introduce printmaking to young children. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arlene. That was fascinating. I'm sure that everyone really enjoyed it. Our next artist, printmaker, who is up, and our panelist is Linda Goldberg. And Linda Goldberg is going to talk about both her inspiration as well as her process in the monotypes, many of which she will be talking about are in the show and a couple aren't. So here is Linda Goldberg.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you all for coming. Again, my name is Linda Goldberg, and I'm a printmaker specializing in monotypes, one-of-a-kind prints on paper, and I use an etching press to capture the detail. And obviously, being in the show, I'm inspired by nature. This first image is of my studio supplies. I use a plexi plate as my substrate, my base, brayers, as does Arlene, and she explained those. In this case, my inks are Caligo inks. They're made by Cranfield, which is an English company. They also are water soluble and oil based. And so cleanup is with soap and water. I use palette knives, tweezers, and other instruments. And for the natural objects, I use leaves, grasses, seeds to create my pieces. In this slide, you can see I use palm tree bark, linaria, both the seed pods and the seeds, tomatillo wrappers, skeleton leaves, basically anything that has a texture, isn't juicy, and is pretty flat. Next. This is me in my studio with my etching press. I'm about to pull, or I am pulling a print, and the press I have can take up to a full sheet of printing paper, which is usually 22 by 30 inches. Next. This piece is Full Moon, and it's in the show. When I went back to printmaking in the year 2000, I wanted to create scenes from nature to transmit my love of nature and its awesomeness to others. In this piece, I wanted to show moonlight in a field. My process is to first ink up the background on the plexiglass plate, and in this case, I used a rich turquoise color, varying it throughout the plexi. I pulled out some of the ink with a rag so that I would have an interesting background. I then inked the grasses and placed them on the plexi plate, ink side up, creating the composition I wanted. Then I placed a damp piece of BFK Reeves printmaking paper on top of that, then newsprint to protect the blankets, and then the blankets. I then ran it through the press. This is the print that resulted. It's the first time through the press. It's a first pull. And as I mentioned, this is a monotype. So there's only one that exists. You can have multiple prints, a first pull, a second pull, third pull, and those, the second and third pull are ghosts. And in my case, the third pull is usually what's left on the plate. And each pull has a different feel and intensity. And to the second and third prints, you can add, before you pull them, you can add or subtract things. And each pull, again, is unique. Next. Okay, this is Rainforest Mist, and it's not in the show. It was inspired by when we went as a family to Costa Rica. It was an organized trip, and we found ourselves in a rainforest on a paved path, and there were leaves on the path. So of course I had to pick them up because they had interesting texture and some holes, as Arlene said. And I forgot about them until we were home and I needed to identify some of the photos. And when I went to the booklet, these leaves fell out. However, I only had a few leaves, and I wanted to create a scene with a rainforest. So how could I do that? Because a rainforest is a sea of green. And I realized that I'd have to use the second and third pulls, the ghost pulls, in order to give the piece depth and a sense of more leaves. So the background, in this case, is the ghost pull, what was left on the plate after the first pull and removing the leaves. And then I took some of the leaves and placed them back on the plate in different places, and these became the midground. And then I re-inked some of the leaves and put those on the plate, and they became the foreground. And then I put a clean piece of BFK damp paper on top of that and ran it through the press, and this is the result. And oh, I created the mist, or the sense of humidity on the print by spritzing water on the plexi plate. And this allowed the ink to separate, since it's water soluble, and to dry as water droplets. And this print is one time through the press. Next. This is Meadow, and it's in the show. And it was inspired by a trip to Chicago that I took with my husband, who was attending a conference for work. And while he was at the conference, I took the train out to Oak Park to tour Frank Lloyd Wright's studio and the houses he built in that neighborhood. I was intrigued by how well the homes fit in their surroundings, their environment, their neutral colors, and how flat the Chicago area is. And also during that time, I took a bike ride along the shore. And in one part, the city had restored the area to its original grasslands. And when I returned home, I wanted to create a series based on what I'd seen and felt. And so this is one of the pieces I created. I used multiple plates, multiple times through the press. I created overlapping shapes, colors, and grasses. Next. This is clematis vines, and it's in the show. And in the spring of the winter, when in Boston we had the 6 feet of snow, the clematis vines on our front stoop railing shed their leaves, its leaves, leaving a fascinating and intriguing tangle of positive and negative shapes. And the challenge was how to print 3D brittle vines with inks and to get those fascinating shapes. I realized I'd have to do a first pull in the press to flatten the vine so that I could then ink them. And also, if I inked the plate, some of that ink would transmit to the vines and make them a little more supple. And the color from the plate would transfer to the paper, and where the original vines would be white, and I could have that as a contrast in the paper, on the print itself. So as you can see in this print, the lighter colors, I then re-inked and went through multiple times, inking my vines and also the paper. That's where the yellow comes in, and when it mixed with the blue, it became green. And the vines are the silvery blue ones as well as the darker ones. So this is a print that was multiple times through the press for both the colors and the vines. And using this, it enabled me to have a background, a midground, and a foreground. Next. Okay, this is Free Fall, and it's in the show. And it was inspired by sunlit pine needles on a black asphalt driveway. And this was at the New Art Center where I teach. And again, it's the amazing positive and negative spaces that intrigued me. And this print is a diptych. I used 2 plates at the same time. The upper plate is a first pull of the plate, and the lower one is a ghost, or what's left on the plate. On the upper one, on the upper print, you'll notice the white lines around the pine needles, and that indicates a first pull. You can also see it on the lower one, but it's a little bit harder. And this happens on a first pull if you're using leaves, eggshells, pine needles, anything that's raised or has a 3D texture to it. And again, the top image is a first pull of the plate, and the bottom is a ghost, but it was run, the plates were put together, and then I ran it through at the same time. And I did overprint with some red pine needles to create unity and flow in the piece. Next, please, thank you. This is Twirling, and it's in the show, and it was inspired by the plumes of water vapor that I saw at the geysers at Yellowstone National Park, as well as at a geyser spot in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And it's the contrast between the dark sky and the dawn light that allows you to see these swirling, twirling plumes of water vapor. And in this print, I used handmade Mexican amate paper, which enhances the feeling of that twirling, swirling movement. And you can see it in the background of the piece. And that's actually the texture of the piece, of the paper. And the smoke bush and corms, which I printed, and also some flowers, I used to create that swirling and twirling, and inked them and placed them appropriately on the paper. And the corms come from a daylily that's native to South Africa, and it was a person in the Nature Printing Society who brought them to a conference, and she shared them with us all. And she grows them in her garden in California. And the other texture is smoke bush, of which there are lots of them at the Arboretum. And the smoke bush part falls to the ground, so you do not have to touch the bushes. Next. This is called Peapod Jungle, and it's not in the show. And I love the shape of the peapods, and I have two stamps, two different peapod stamps. So this piece is used a monotype background, and I used the press to create that. And then I overprinted with those two different peapod stamps multiple times, over and over again, different colors, different placement. And it was fun to layer the colors and the shapes. Next. This last image is called My Rainbow. It's not in the show. And I created it during COVID. And I wanted to create a very colorful piece because these are difficult times. And I just wanted something to brighten my day. So this is a ghost or a second pull. And I used leaves, Queen Anne's, lace, thread, and other things to create it. And that's it for my images. But I also wanted to tell you that generally when I go to overprint, I wait a week for the inks to dry. And in order to flatten my prints, I layer them on the floor between newsprint, put a plexiglass plate on top of that, and then books. And again, wait about a week for that. And that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Linda. Very inspiring, actually. I just want to go out after hearing what you and Arlene had to say about making prints, the ideas behind them. You all make it look and sound so easy. As an artist myself, I know it's not. Printmaking has never been something I've done, but really, really interesting. Our third panelist and artist is Amy McGregor-Radin. And she's actually going to be talking just about something that I've always been very interested in and partial to, and that's woodline woodcuts. Amy?
Thank you, Sheryl. I have been creating white line woodcuts since 2002 when I just happened into a show at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I was totally inspired and really haven't looked back. All of my pieces in the 5 Printmakers show were created using this printmaking method. So you can see it can be used to make my version of representational art and abstract images as well. White line printing is historically associated with Massachusetts. It was devised in Provincetown in the early 1900s by the artists who had fled the war from Europe and wanted to find a way to simplify the traditional Japanese woodcut printing, which involves multiple pieces of board and complex registration and very precise work. The white line method it can be precise, but it involves incising just one board with a design and then hand painting each shape on the board. And I will show you one of the boards for one of the pieces that is in the show. It's here. It's a little bit hard, but these incised lines, which I'll show you how I cut them, create the white line that results from your printing process. You transfer the color to the paper using anything, including your hands. I use a polished rock. Some people say that the original printmakers used a silver spoon. Gail Smalley, whose work is in the show, also uses a spoon, but she uses a wooden spoon and she gets a beautiful ethereal look to her prints that way. Anyway, you use something to create pressure so that the paint on your board ends up on the paper. It gets its name from the white lines. This piece is called Winter Woods, and it is in the show, the 5 Printmakers show. And then from this board came this print, which I call Point of View Pine. It was my effort, my attempt at imagining what it would be like to be inside a tree and looking up. While every design from white line can be printed many times over on this board, each one is done individually and is therefore unique because you never can quite get the same colors or the same pressure or atmosphere. I'm often drawn to a scene or an angle of an object or the view of horizon, and those are the things I love using for white line woodcuts, partly as a way of investigating them and memorizing them for myself and hopefully inspire other people as well. I'll show you the steps involved. I'm going to do a little switcheroo here. Bear with me. Okay. So you start with a simple drawing. I work often from photographs because I'm often on the run and see something that I like and want to hold on to it. You try and have something that has some enclosed spaces so that your white lines will show up on your prints. After you've completed your drawing, and I spend a long time on the drawing generally, so that once is on the board, I am sure that I'm going to like the resulting print. After that, you just get plain tracing paper and trace your image. Very simply. This is also a chance to tweak any lines that don't look great or might need to be enlarged so that you can actually get a paintbrush in there. It's a chance to do a little fine tuning. After you've completed your tracing, then you're going to flip it. You're going to flip it from your original drawing so that when it actually prints, you will get the image as you drew it. So you tape it onto your plain pine board in this case. And in order to transfer it, I use something that is available at most art supply stores. It's a carbon, it's like carbon paper, which some of us used to use, but it's graphite, so you can erase it from your board. You put it graphite side down. We all make the mistake of putting it the wrong side now and then. And then again, you go over your drawing. With a fair amount of pressure, but it usually doesn't take
too much pressing. So there's his beak, his head, and you would complete this. And I'm just going to flip this board where I've completed the drawing. Obviously, it would be all on the same side of the board when you're doing it. And now comes the fun part. This is where you begin to cut in or incise around the board to create just a little V. So you want to create a little V trough, and that's where you're going to paint up to, and then leave it so that it creates the white line. And to do that, I use a number 10 blade on from X-Acto. When I first started out, I was most comfortable and successful with a number 19 blade. And I go back to that now and then. Oh, that's the 10. This is the 19. Number 10 blade has a curve to it. And I found that was easy to manipulate. This number 19 blade has a little more surface area, so I've been using that most recently. You hold it as much as you can at a 45-degree angle. You don't have to really push too far down. You carve along one side of your line. Then you flip the board and carve along. Now, always keep your hand up here. In case your knife slips, which it probably won't. So I've created a little bit of a line. It does not take as much as you'd think to leave space for the white line to show up. So once you've carved the entire board, I take an eraser. You can use a pink pearl, you can use a gum eraser, anything that will just clean the board up, because you can see there's quite a bit of graphite smudge on here. It just means that it won't get, if you clean it up a little bit with an eraser, it won't end up on your paper. But then, once you've cleaned up your board, it's time to register the paper. And Arlene talked about her simple method of registering. All of us who do printmaking have one form or another of registering. This was taught to me, and it's been great for me. You take an extra piece of your paper and just create a little envelope and slip the edge of the paper into that and rummage around your house for those thumbtacks that don't get very used anymore and attach it to the side of your pine board. You'll see I've left room when I place the image for that registration. The double layers, triple layers of paper mean that my holes won't increase as I flip this back and forth during printing. If they get bigger, then the registration shifts just ever so slightly. The paper shifts ever so slightly and your image will be off a little bit. So this keeps it in place while you paint. just like our other two demonstrators today, I use a water-based product. In this case, it's not an ink, it's just tubes of watercolor. And you can use the tubes in a pan as well. Other artists who do this use gouache, which is also water soluble and is a little bit more opaque. I just prefer this. So you put a little bit in here. And you want to have a brush that holds a fair amount of paint and water, in this case, so that you're not scrubbing onto the board, which is what I did when I started out, until somebody told me I was making it harder on myself. Then you want to add a little bit of water until your watercolor is more or less the consistency of half and half, something like that. I always keep a little piece of the same kind of paper nearby just to test my color before I put it on the board. And I'm gonna go a little crazy here and make him blue just for purposes of demonstration. You paint up to your line. And then if it goes over, you can do the little quick thumb. If you have mixed too much water in, then it will bleed into the wood and across your lines, across your white lines. If it doesn't have enough water, your paper will stick when you're trying to pull it up. It's live and learn, it's trial and error, but you do get to see, after a time, you get comfortable with that. You can see where between his red piece, headpiece, and the place where I painted has left the white line. And then you go, you don't ink like you do in other methods, because you only do a little bit at a time, little spaces at a time, because the paint dries on board. And then you have to go back and do it again. And depending on how much saturation of color you want, you can press lightly, even with your hand, or I happen to like a lot of saturation. So I might have to go back over because of the variation. But for some images, that might be just what you would want to get. So you keep going until your entire print is complete. You paint, flip, transfer, and just keep painting, rubbing, and painting, rubbing, flipping until the whole print is done. The paper I have come to love is called a Kochi paper, K-O-C-H-I. And we're going to put supply lists in, we're going to give them to people at the Arboretum so that you can get those from us. But this paper is machine made, but has a very nice hand to it, and it absorbs but doesn't soak through. So I've been happy with that. You can also use a heavier paper or a lighter paper. It takes some experimentation, and you'll find something that works for you. After the print is all done, I actually walk away from it for a night just to come back while it's registered to make sure that I have covered all the bits and pieces and that I'm happy with the colors. After that, I take it off, set the print aside, and you then wash the board with just a mild soap and a soft sponge. The colors will still remain on the board as they have on here. This is a washed board after the first print, but they generally do not transfer to a second and subsequent prints. And I let my boards dry flat overnight so that they're sure to be good and dry, because otherwise the paint will puddle if you try and do it on a wet board. I have tried that. I love this for its low-tech, flexible, because it is low-tech and flexible, and it is very portable. When I first started out, I literally did it at my kitchen table, and I could clear it off quickly and set it aside and set the table for dinner. So it was just right for a busy household. Materials are all pretty easily available. The hardest thing to get might be this paper, this particular paper, but this is just from a local lumber store. And you can also use scrap that you find around. As long as it has a smooth surface, you're good to go. We'll take question and answers for all of us after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. And again, thanks to all of our panelists. We have a number of questions and we'll be answering them. I want to thank all the attendees as well as our panelists. It's been really, really wonderful to have so many people here. If you have questions, do please put them in the question rather than in the chat. Pam Thompson is here. She's our manager of adult education at the Arboretum, and she's going to be helping me facilitate the questions. So I think we'll just do one after the other and get going. So I'm going to bring up the questions so that we can see them, and maybe Pam could start with the first question, which I believe is directed to Arlene.
I'm actually going to start at the very end, or kind of on my own. On the last artist, could you, the wood that you were working with, I assume is a soft wood, is that correct?
That's right. My fault.
Okay, so it is soft wood.
It's pine.
Yep, just wanted to clarify that. All right, the first question, here we go. After the first question was, is the gel plate able to be reused and with different colors or just with red, if at all?
One of the wonderful things about the gel plate is it's definitely reusable. I'm talking about these purchased gel plates. I think I mentioned that our colleague, Mary Beth Maisel, who has wonderful art in this show, makes her own plates out of gelatin. They're a little trickier, but the commercial gel plates can be used over and over and over again. I think I mentioned that for that demo, I wasn't cleaning between rolling colors, but you know, depending on how particular you are and what you're after, you can thoroughly just wipe off the plate and move to whatever color you want.
Great, and I think you probably answered that. If you can reuse it, can you reuse it? just as many times as you want. Actually, someone else from the Arboretum has asked if you have multiple jelly plates lined up, one for each color, could you do it that way if you didn't want to mix colors?
You could. You can also, one of the things I do like to do is to work with a number of jelly plates and kind of make diptychs or triptychs, like putting a bigger piece of paper over everything. There's lots of ways to ink the plate. I was trying to show a very, very simple way today.
All right. And just one more, I think, for you, Arlene. Someone was asking about the leaves and do you put the most textured side up or down? And I think you showed us that you do both. Is that correct?
Well, when I'm first, my own aesthetic, what I tend to do, which isn't, the one thing about this is there really isn't a right way or a wrong way. There's just different ways. But I tend to like to take the part of the leaf that has the most texture and place it into the ink, like down, because then I'm inking up that leaf so I can use it later. My own experience has been that when I use a jelly plate, my best way for inking these plates, these leaves, is to do that. I haven't been as successful when I just take my inked brayer and roll it over an ink and then a leaf, excuse me, and then put the leaf on the plate. So it serves two purposes. It makes a nice little pattern in the what's left on the jelly plate, but it also gives me a leaf that's well inked up to use flipped in another print.
Great. I think I'm going to ask this of Linda, and probably it pertains to all of our artists here, but how many failures are there for every amazing print that is chosen for display? And I'll ask Linda first.
Yeah, I think Arlene and I have been in the same class, and I think the teacher had said it's like 20% success to 80% failure. Again, the failures you can collage and collate, cut up, you can overprint, you can add different mediums too. So it's not all that, but there are a lot of, I wouldn't call them failures, but your top prints and getting it as a first pull or your first time, or if you've imagined, you know, an extended process, it's not rare, but you really have to work at it.
Thank you. I'll let Pam ask another question.
I'm sorry, I was distracted by the answering. Okay, here's a good one for Amy. Why do you choose to use the X-Acto knife technique rather than using a regular wood carving tool?
That's a very good question. The answer is that's how I was taught. That's the short answer. And then I did try the tiniest V from the Japanese woodcut tools, which are, to me, exquisite. And I have used them for traditional woodcuts. But I am a failure at sharpening them myself. So the X-Acto knives can change the blade, because I use a new blade for every print, even the simplest ones, just so it's nice and sharp and makes a nice curve or detail. So it's partly lack of skill on sharpening the blade, the traditional cutting blades, and also access.
Great. Just a really quick question for Amy. I think you can just answer this with a couple words, and then I have a question for Linda. I believe you said that you got your pine boards from the hardware store. Was that correct?
A lumber store, yep.
Lumber store, and they can just cut them to size?
Every store is a little different. Some will only do one cut, some will charge per cut. Sometimes there are scraps in the bins that you can just pick up. I have a beautiful Japanese wood saw that I just use in my studio here over a wastebasket. So.
And real quickly, what was the paper that you said you were using?
I use it, it's called Kochi paper, K-O-C-H-I.
Thank you. Linda, here's one for you. How do you directly ink the leaves and natural materials that I know in your monotypes, you're actually inking them? Brush, brayer?
I use a brayer to ink my leaves, and it's, I too prefer the veined side or the textured side, and I will ink it on a flat surface. In my studio, I have plexiglass over my table. You can also use a glass plate, just something that's flat, and I will ink the brayer, and that can be random, and you can mix your color. And then I will ink it on the leaf, and I will go down one side of the spine and then down the other side of the spine and then over the top. And you can also do multiple colors. You could ink the base in one color and then the veins in another. You can play around with that. And then I do the same thing that Arlene does. You know, you've got it runs through the press, you can flip the leaf, you can add, subtract. It's a monotype, it's one of a kind.
Great. I'm just gonna ask Arlene one thing, and then maybe Pam can follow up with one more question. If you have questions that we haven't been able to answer, we put up on the chat an address, our web at arnarb.harvard.edu. You may email that link and ask any of your questions. We can go to specific artists if there's a specific artist you're interested in asking the question of. So I'm just going to ask a real quick question, as I said, of Arlene, and then maybe Pam. There's one in here that Pam thinks will be a good question to be answered. Arlene, is the texture of the gel plate affected by heat?
Not that I've been aware of. I don't think so. And I think that the manufacturers have tried very, very hard to produce something that withstands a lot. I think they're very, very, very capable of taking a certain amount of abuse.
Great.
All right, I guess one last question. Have any of you used styrofoam as your base plate, and specifically with white line, but my guess is it gives you a little bit less fine.
I'm going to speak to that quickly. I do a lot with styrofoam, and you get something similar, but one of the things about the white line on wood is the wood itself is organic, and often in Amy's prints particularly, often fabulous stuff happens just with the grain of the wood itself. You lose that with styrofoam. Now, having said that, the advantage of styrofoam is that you can easily cut it with scissors. You can use it with young children. As an adult artist, I use it a lot in creating reduction block prints. So the thing about all of this is nothing has a right or wrong answer. There's so many possibilities, which is what makes printmaking so wonderfully exciting.
Great. Amy, you want to add to that?
Arlene taught me actually that with children, you can use the vegetable trays that come and use a pencil or a chopstick for them to make designs. You register the paper with masking tape of some sort, and they can use watercolor or even markers to do a very nice image. It's a lot of fun. I've used it for craft projects at various organizations. Great,
great. This was wonderful. Thanks, Pam, for helping with the questions and everything else. Thank you to all the attendees. It's just wonderful. We've had really, really wonderful feedback from all of you, so I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thanks especially to our three presenters, Linda, Amy, and Arlene. as well as the two, Mary Beth and Gail, who couldn't be here to join us, but their show, Inspired by Nature, is fabulous. I thank you all. Visit the Arboretum, visit the website, see the show, and have a wonderful upcoming weekend. Thank you all.